Okay. Hi. My name's Jeffrey. This is a special presentation. I'm so used to saying, hi, my name's Jeffrey. Welcome to the Front-End Web Development class. We're going to get started with a recap because that's what I used to do here a whole lot. But anyway, hi. This is a little presentation that I put together on what's changed over the years. My name's Jeffrey. I have been making websites in one form or other since 1994. And I guess I professionally started in 2000. You know, I made websites for like local businesses or whatever else, and called myself a lot of different names. The names over the years, they change a lot. Webmaster. Considered myself more a web designer because I wasn't actually coding anything. But now I consider myself a full stack or software engineer or whatever you want to call it. Before that guy came around, thanks you. I was teaching here evenings at Noisebridge from 2011 to 2016, and just taught a lot over the years. And I've been at my current job, LabZero, since 2010, just doing a whole bunch of front-end projects. At LabZero, we're an agency, and we just do a lot of things for a lot of different people. I think that at this point I've worked with 23 different clients since I started. So like I know a lot about how different companies use different things, in case anyone was skeptical of my credentials. Anyway, I'm here to talk about what's changed, specifically since I started teaching at Noisebridge in around 2011. In 2011, there were a lot of different trends, a lot of different sorts of new things happening. I was starting to teach when the terms HTML5 and CSS3 were very popular. And of course, before that, there was Web 2.0, and before that, there was, I don't know, VRML. Now there's VR again, and WebGL. But anyway, yeah, a lot of stuff was different then. Things are different now, so I'm going to start out with what has changed. I'd say the most prominent thing that's changed since 2011 is the introduction of mobile-first development. Pretty straightforward, but the idea is that mobile traffic has surpassed desktop traffic. There are more phones and tablets accessing the internet than there are laptops now. So, what that means for you, a web developer, a software engineer, whatever else, is that you should consider, if you're going to be making a website, catering it toward mobile devices first. Obviously, you have to be aware of the audience. There are certain applications that are made for people to use on their workstations in an office or a factory or something like that. But at the same time, overall, if you're making a general purpose website, mobile is usually the way to start. And mobile does not necessarily mean small. Just because it's the term is mobile, and because we talk about phones to start out. The first smartphones were like the iPhone and what have you. Now we've got displays that are the size or larger in many cases than desktop displays, like the iPad Pro. That's a 12-inch tablet. There are tablets that are even larger than that. There's Surfaces. There's the big Cintiq type Microsoft Surface sort of thing. It's on your desktop that you use your fingers on. I'm not sure if that would be really considered a tablet per se, but still, we're talking about a lot of devices that no longer have mouse input and need a lot of different ways of inputting things. So, that said, one thing that has changed significantly since 2011 has been I'm seeing fewer and fewer, this is a good thing, m.something.com websites, mobile.something.com. Essentially, what used to happen was servers used to sniff out what kind of browser you were using by your user agent string. They were trying to see, are you an iPhone? Are you Firefox on Windows? Are you Netscape Navigator on Solaris? Are you whatever else? And what they would do is they would serve you a different website based on what device you have. And that is not what people do anymore. I'm going to go to the next thing. So what people should really do is focus on catering the exact same website toward everybody, but using a combination of CSS and JavaScript to detect which browsers can do which things to serve to everybody. I'll talk about browser compatibility in a little bit more. But basic things that make things better for mobile devices. One is this concept of media queries in CSS, which has been around for a long time, but is very prevalent now more than ever. But one big change is the idea that you should be catering your media queries. Let me back up. A media query is a part of CSS, which of course is the presentational part of web development, makes stuff look good. And there's a rule that you can write in CSS that makes things look different depending on the device that you're looking at it on. What people used to do was say, this is what my website looks like. Here it is. Here's my big, giant website for large, big screens. In the rare case that you've got this small screen that you're looking at on, I'm going to say, at a max width of something, make it look this way. But you really should just be flipping that around. Mobile first essentially means making it look good on a phone first, and then starting to add columns or different sorts of good features that actually fill up a nice big screen if that screen is big. So essentially use min width rules instead of max width. Like I said earlier, mobile users are going to want to do everything that desktop users want to do. Everything. I mean, still, there are those m.whatever websites out there, and they have a little thing on the bottom that says switch to desktop mode. And a lot of people still tap those things because they can't figure out how to do certain stuff. One real big culprit in the year 2017 is GitHub. GitHub has this mobile view that makes it really difficult to view code. It's not impossible. It's difficult to view code, difficult to create issues, difficult to sort of like participate in the community. They don't expect that anybody on the go is going to actually want to communicate with other people, which is funny. So, I'm being a little harsh, but you should be making a single website that works on all devices and has full functionality regardless of what device you're using. So yeah, try to use as much of the DOM as possible. Instead of having like a special menu for mobile and then a larger menu for so-and-so, like you can use the exact same UL or a nav or div or whatever that contains your navigation stuff or your introduction or your hero or any other part of your site, and make sure that it simply just loads the same, displays, obviously it doesn't display the same, that's where CSS comes in to make things look different, but has the same role regardless of what you're using. So, you don't have to have entirely separate code for this display or that display. Finally, remember, there's no such thing as a mouse on mobile devices. And, going forward, there will probably be fewer and fewer mouse users. So, this whole concept of your cursor being something that moves around the screen that you can see is going out the door. So don't expect to be able to hover over a target to see a menu or hover over something to see more information. That's gone. Don't do that anymore. Pretend that there's no such thing as hovering. Pretend there's no such thing. Imagine no mouse is mice. And similarly, make sure that people can use their fingers to click things. You don't want to have very small text. I mean, one trend that's changed over the years with web development is, of course, that, well, I don't know, things have basically gotten bigger. I mean, even though certain screens are small, text is larger, buttons are larger, images are larger. There's just generally fewer things on the screen at one time. Just making pages longer, of course, but just the ability to actually sort of perceive yourself without having to squint. Not packing as much stuff into your browser window at the same time as possible is necessary. Anyway, back to what I was saying earlier. No one says HTML5 and CSS3 anymore. One of the biggest changes, and this really started when Chrome came about around 2008-ish or whatever, was that browsers now update themselves. Browsers are always giving you the latest, greatest things. They're called evergreen browsers because they're always new, except for, of course, in the case that you're on some sort of weird enterprise computer that's locked to a specific version, or if you haven't restarted your browser in a really long time. But still, because these browsers continue to update, every other month or so with new features, new functionality, we're not really locked to these versions anymore, knowing whether a browser can support HTML 5.2 or CSS layer 3 or 4 or whatever. Really, we just call it HTML and CSS. In the case of JavaScript, there is sort of a difference in like naming and whatever, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. By the way, I should say, as I used to with all my classes, if anyone has any questions or anything that they want me to clarify as I go through, please feel free to ask. We actually have quite a lot of time to schmooze and whatever. So yeah, hey.
What's an evergreen browser?
Evergreen browser is a browser that updates itself. So essentially every browser. Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Actually, maybe that's it. Opera, but not really Safari. Safari does not really update itself. You need to do OS updates for that. And Internet Explorer 11 is the last version of Internet Explorer, so there's that. But yeah, I mean, like all the other browsers, generally most of the big ones are they update themselves with new features. Pretty, you know, and you can tell if I go to like this about here, it'll tell me what version I'm using, and sometimes it will even download a new version. Oh, see, look, it's updated because version 60 is not the latest. So it's thanks for that. Cool. Yep. All right. Let me go back to, oh, here it is. That's what an evergreen browser is. Cool. In the same vein, browser compatibility is a lot easier to deal with than it used to. In 2011, when I started teaching, I literally devoted half of my classes and I literally devoted half of my time at work dealing with browser incompatibility. Because at the time, Internet Explorer 6 was still being used by people. Internet Explorer 7 got a little better, 8 a little bit better, but now that we've really only got 11 to deal with, and because all the other browsers generally have a lot of the same functionality, this is a screenshot from caniuse.com, which is a really helpful site, especially if you're trying to figure out which browsers support what. You know, using feature detection, using different methods to see what browsers do certain things is great, but this specifically is a database telling you what modern or not so modern browsers support which features nowadays. These numbers, 291 to 223, are just essentially like scores based on the amount of features they have on the site, saying how good they are at doing certain things. Now, Edge lags behind these guys, but not by much, really, if you think about it. You know, I mean, I would say probably in comparison, Internet Explorer is probably like half of that. Internet Explorer 8 is probably half of that. 6, probably 1 or 2 or something. So the fact that these browsers are pretty much similar in terms of the amount of things that they support is good news. So certain amount of things that can help with browser compatibility in today's age. I mean, like I said, there are certain features that certain browsers support and certain ones don't. And if you really want to be on the bleeding edge and do the latest and greatest, coolest stuff, you know, you want to use HTML, or you want to use CSS Grid, which is like one of the cool new ways of laying things out two-dimensionally. It's like two-dimensional Flexbox. Or you want to use AR, like ARKit in iOS 11, which isn't even out yet. The ability to use WebGL to like look around and like, you know, superimpose stuff on top of your camera stuff. You can use feature detection. You don't say, is this iOS 11? Or is this, you know, Chrome 61 that supports CSS Grid? No, what you do is you use libraries such as Modernizer, which is a JavaScript library that runs when your page runs, and simply gives you a checklist of what the current browser that you're currently running supports. So your site doesn't need to say, is this Chrome, is this Firefox, is this Safari, etc. Also, supports is something that's in CSS that's similar. Essentially, it's if you can create a little block in your CSS file that adds additional functionality if certain features are supported. I don't know, there are also different ways of doing it. Modernizer also adds HTML classes to your HTML element, so you could use CSS that way as well. So there are different things that you can do if you really care about certain modern features that you're targeting. There's also the ability to write code that falls back to older code, depending on the browser that's being used. I'll talk about the examples of transpilation and polyfills, interesting words. One example of transpiling is Autoprefixer or CSS Next or PostCSS. Essentially, what you've got is you can write very modern CSS. You can write CSS with all the newest, coolest features, things that browsers don't even support yet. You can write it right now, today. And you simply just run it through a program such as Autoprefixer or a series or a suite of different transformations through PostCSS. You can learn about it. It's essentially you just find different ways to run it through. If you're making websites nowadays that use Webpack or Grunt or Gulp or Brunch or whatever, you can basically just pipe your CSS through something like this that'll transform it into something that works in better browsers. So you write it this way, and it shows up in your actual resulting CSS file this way, which means it works in better browsers. More browsers. That said, these sorts of things, -WebKit -, -MS -, these were sort of I don't know, kind of interim rules to make sure, or interim properties to make sure that more browsers support newer things. But now that most browsers are evergreen and changing all the time, we really don't care that much about these special rules that target these sorts of weird little edge cases. Most of the time, just writing this is usually okay for the majority of your audience. That said, it doesn't really hurt to use something like Autoprefixer or CSS Next to get all the stuff that you need. Another example is for JavaScript, Babel. This is what modern ECMAScript, ECMAScript 21x looks like. You have the ability to create constants. You can create arrow functions that don't actually have a function keyword there. You can do interpolation with these template strings. You can interpolate. You can do a whole bunch of cool stuff. But not every browser supports this. So, to make sure that that almost every browser that can run JavaScript does support it, you can use Babel, which simply just runs your newer JavaScript through the program and outputs older JavaScript, essentially, that runs the same way. That said, evergreen browsers, including Safari and including pretty much every modern browser, they all support this anyway. So, with Autoprefixer, with CSS Next, with Babel, you can make targets. You can say, like, I'm targeting these sorts of features. I'm assuming that certain things aren't supported in this year, but maybe if you're writing something that, a few years down the road, that you don't think anyone's going to be using IE 11 anymore. You don't think that anybody's going to be using older versions of so-and-so. It becomes less and less of a problem every single year to have to deal with these sorts of slight incompatibilities or whatever else. So these are transpolations. I also mentioned the term polyfill. A polyfill is a little piece of code that implements functionality that the browser is missing. Simple as that. There's this whole thing such as the Web Animations API. There's the ability to use JavaScript to create an animation on the page. Not every browser supports it, but there is an actual polyfill that sort of like creates that functionality for browsers that don't yet actually have it in there yet. So there's a whole bunch of there's also a whole bunch of much smaller polyfills. There are new array methods and object methods, new sorts of things that are built into JavaScript that certain browsers don't have yet. So introducing a suite of polyfills, just little snippets of things, will allow you to run more modern JavaScript, even though the browser hasn't been ready to support that stuff. So there's a lot of different ways of making sure things can be up to date. Any questions so far? Okay. Floats. You don't need to use floats anymore. That's one thing about CSS that's really confounded a lot of people for a long time. One of the more difficult parts, how's it going? Yeah. Of laying out a page is not having to use floats anymore, which have been used basically in the past to lay things out horizontally, one after another. Pretty much Flexbox takes care of almost all of the problems that people used to have with floats. The biggest difference basically being that with floats, you would say, this thing is float left. That means that things are going to stack horizontally next to it. The difference is with Flexbox, you basically say a container. Everything inside this container is going to go from left to right, or everything inside this container is going to go from bottom to top, or whatever. And doing it on the container level versus the individual level makes it a lot better, a lot easier to understand. And the good thing is that pretty much every browser supports it at this point. The only thing that people would still want to use floats for is text wrapping. Have you ever seen a news article where you've got like text wrapping around an image on all three sides of it, or whatever, or sometimes even all four sides? I don't know if that works. Floats will still allow you to do that, and Flexbox doesn't do any sort of non-floated content wrapping around sort of thing. But anyway, that's a cool thing. Yes.
So you were mentioning grid code. So is someone learning grid instead of Flexbox, or learning both, or?
I have no opinion because I haven't spent enough time learning it. But a CSS grid is essentially the ability to lay out a two-dimensional grid of things. Very much like kind of how people used to use tables for certain things. Grids are great for if you want to have multiple columns or rows of certain things that all line up. If you have like two Flexbox containers, one stacked on top of another, a difficulty might be that you're trying to get like, you're not only trying to get these things to line up from left to right, but you're also trying to say like, cell A is the same width as cell A2, or cell B up here is the same. basically you want to have things line up not only, you know, horizontally, but also have them sort of like meet each other's widths as they go down the page. So, you know, like a grid, like just. You know. So that's why grid is cool. That's why you might find it useful. I personally haven't found any use for it so far, and also it's not 100% like really baked, fully baked just yet. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe they finally reached a specification for it, but either way, I mean, that's something to look to in the future, but I just don't know that much about it personally because I haven't had to use it. Yeah. All right. You probably, at this point, you really probably don't need jQuery. Most browsers can do the majority of stuff that jQuery used to do. Yeah, now more than ever, you might not need jQuery. This is from earlier this year. It's basically, if you go down the page and you take a look, here's what you do with jQuery, here's what you do without jQuery. You know, single line to remove an element off the page. Prepend something, to put something at the very beginning of a series of items. It works just without jQuery. There's a whole bunch of things. As you go down the page, as you can see, the code snippets to do things with jQuery versus without jQuery are almost always, you know, the same. That said, it's not supported in all different places, so you know, you might still find yourself using maybe jQuery for certain things, or at least polyfills or transpilation to make sure that what you're doing works in different places. You know, there are some certain things that jQuery still does well, like certain kinds of animations or certain kinds of other sorts of interactions that might take a little bit more code to write. But generally, the era of jQuery is kind of reaching an end. We're finding fewer and fewer reasons to really need to use jQuery, this UI, this library that helps us write JavaScript, because JavaScript is much easier to write. So, you know, there's that. You know, that said, it still patches over rough spots. It's not bad to use it. It's slimmer and faster than ever. So really, at the end of the day, it's not a big deal. But most of the time, not necessary. Mockup tools have improved. If you're a front-end web developer and you've worked with designers, you might have in the past been given a Photoshop file. A Photoshop file might have a zillion layers with a whole bunch of boxes layer on top of each other, text here, text there, colors here, colors there. Really, that's bad. Photoshop, I think, is best used for photos. Shop. You know, that's the name of it. And you know, trying to use it as a general illustration tool, fine, totally. I think it's great for painting, great for, you know, illustration, comics, cartoons, you know, fine art, what have you. Great. But for web development, it really doesn't do the job very well, because if you give a developer a Photoshop file, you're expecting them to open it up, parse out all the layers, do measurements by hand, use an eyedropper to figure out which colors are what. Use the text tool to figure out like what fonts are used in specific places. If they need to extract certain things from it and save them, that's difficult, especially if you're trying to save vector images like SVGs and whatever. Photoshop really is not the tool for the job now more than ever. Sketch is excellent, and XD and Framer are very similar. Oh, at least XD is similar. I'll talk about Framer in a second. Sketch and Adobe XD, which is pretty much Adobe's version of Sketch, is great for creating UI, for creating web or, you know, native app user interfaces, because, you know, it's for one thing, it's a vector-based tool, not a bitmap-based tool. The measurements and the different sorts of you know, effects and you know, all the different parts of CSS that CSS supports, you can do the same thing in Sketch, and it translates pretty much one-to-one. In fact, when you export your Sketch files, you can even get CSS out of it and simply just copy and paste it into a CSS file. Measurements, all you do is you click on something and see the space between this element and that element with a click of a button. So no more needing to use little tools to like draw marquees between things to see what the distances are. All that sort of stuff has gone out the window because modern designers use Sketch or XD or whatever else. So that's really good news for front-end web development. Framer, yeah. I have no idea what's good for Linux. What I do know is that although Sketch, I believe, is only for Mac and Windows, there is a web-based tool called Zeppelin, Z-E-P-L-I-N, which essentially takes Sketch files and hosts them kind of like Dropbox. So you can use a web-based interface to navigate through a Sketch file without even downloading the file or whatever else. You've always got the latest version. It's the best way for designers to communicate with developers. And so, of course, since it's the web, it's cross-platform. But if you are a designer yourself and you're trying to use Linux to design something, I don't know what to tell you. You know, I'm not really sure if I'd have any recommendations. Framer, by the way, is one example of a few different tools that help with animation, user interaction in a more kind of like, you know, flowing, cool, you know, kind of wow factor sort of thing. Framer, just really quick, you know, Framer allows you to create high fidelity prototypes where, you know, like you've got all this animation going around here with things swiping left and right, whatever else. So this helps designers easily create these sorts of things and then deliver them to developers. And under the hood, oftentimes the JavaScript's actually already written by Framer. Not that you necessarily want to use generated stuff like that, but it does give you an exact idea of the sorts of Bezier curves and durations and different sorts of, like, you know, X to Y sort of transitions that you want to use. So, you know, there are great tools for that sort of thing as well. Let's take a drink of water. Any questions?
How far away are we from those things writing JavaScript?
I think that's never going to happen. Auto-generated JavaScript is usually not a great idea. That's generally been the history of all what you see is what you get type experiences. The generated code you get is never as good as stuff that's written by hand. You know, and simply just integrating these sorts of interactions and flows and sorts of animations with a current code base is probably more trouble than it's worth. So really, I mean, you know, even though Sketch and XD can like generate CSS, I would say as a developer, I'm not going to use every single line of that CSS. I'm going to use maybe 75% of it and throw away certain things that I think could be either implemented better or simply don't apply if I'm applying it to my current code base or whatever. So, you know, I mean, I would say that even though there are tools that generate these sorts of things for you, whether it's your choice to use them, but I usually err on the side of doing stuff by hand. I usually find that it ends up a better product, more maintainable product too, going into the future. Here's another funny thing, a slide to put, especially here in this audience at Noisebridge. Microsoft is good now. Microsoft is a first-class citizen of the web. They have been making some really, really good, mostly open source stuff that people use all the time. Microsoft Edge is not open source, of course, but it is their browser that comes installed with Windows 10, and it is leaps and bounds beyond Internet Explorer 11, and it continues to get updated, and they continue to put forward new specs and write them into the W3C specs like they should, and you know, it's generally fast, it's generally secure as you can say Microsoft stuff is, et cetera, but there's that. Visual Studio Code is a really good text editor that's very similar to Atom or Brackets or other sorts of really kind of, you know, modern basic IDEs. It's cross-platform, it's open source. I submitted a few PRs against it. I mean, it's a good tool. And TypeScript is a super class. Super. What do you call it? What's the term? It sits on top of JavaScript. It is a super language of JavaScript. It adds static typing to JavaScript. It also adds a few cool extra features that like ECMAScript type stuff has as well. So you can now write statically typed JavaScript. You can, you know, define objects and arrays and numbers and strings and, you know, create a lot of specific constraints that make your code not only run faster and better, but also, you know, prevents it from compiling in the case that you're accidentally passing the wrong thing or forgetting to pass something into this or that or whatever. So TypeScript is one of a few different tools, another one being Flow, which is an type annotation system that sits on top of JavaScript that makes the language more mature and, you know, more just better to type, better to write to code than ever. So this is Microsoft's contribution to the web, which is good. And on that note, JavaScript has become the most popular programming language. Popular, of course, is somewhat of a subjective term. You know, it's really hard to exactly say how many lines of whatever else are being written. But like GitHub and whatever else, they're seeing the most JavaScript commits. There's, you know, Stack Exchange, whatever else. Most of the questions nowadays are about JavaScript. JavaScript has become a massive, massive ecosystem. And that's a very big difference than how things used to be. JavaScript is a very, very fast language thanks to just-in-time compiling, things like the V8 engine that originated with Chrome, that found its way into Node.js. Node.js is a server language. It essentially allows you to run JavaScript on the server, run HTTP servers written entirely in JavaScript, run databases written entirely in JavaScript, run applications, run native applications on your computer, on your phone, written in JavaScript. So that's good stuff. ECMAScript is the the specification name for JavaScript. It is like the more official kind of name for it. And new editions of ECMAScript always come out every year with new cool features that are missing in JavaScript, stuff in different languages. Spread and REST parameters, generators and decorators, and a whole bunch of really cool stuff is making its way into the JavaScript language. And like I said, static typing in JavaScript, thanks to type annotation or super languages like TypeScript that make it better than ever. Yeah.
I don't understand static typing.
Static typing, let me give you an example. Let's see. Hopefully this will give me a little example. Playground, using classes. So here is TypeScript on the left, and here's JavaScript on the right. This class here specifies certain things, such as this class greeter is going to have a string called greeting. But here inside this function, which is not really an actual class, it has no such thing as greeting because it just assumes that in the constructor, which is over here, that greeting will be defined. Here, this constructor expects that the message being passed in will be of type string. If somewhere else in this code we try to instantiate a greeter but not pass in a string as part of the constructor, it's not even going to compile the JavaScript. It's not even going to reach the browser because it's going to complain and say, hey, you made a mistake on this line. You're passing the wrong thing into this thing because you specified that only a string must be passed into this thing. Let's see, what else here? There's let instead of var. That's something that's also available in ECMAScript editions or whatever else. Let me see here. I don't know. That's generally the biggest difference is the ability to, well, there's classes for one thing. Let's see what else there is. There's
the classes compared to ECMAScript 6 classes.
The same, pretty much the same. Like TypeScript has the same concept. It uses the whole ECMAScript class specification. So it works the same way. You've got a constructor. It's under the hood. It's still creating sort of prototypes and what have you. There's unions in type. So this name could either be a string or it could be an array of strings. So when you use it from now on, name or name array, you make sure that whatever's being passed into this function, name, will either be a string or an array, or else it simply will not compile and not reach your browser. So it just allows you to write better JavaScript because you are making sure that you're not getting the wrong stuff. You're never performing an operation on the wrong type of data. And by type, I don't only mean string versus number versus whatever, but I mean like you can create a type that says this object must contain these 3 things inside it, and these 3 things must be of type so-and-so, or it's a union of this and that, or like, there's a whole bunch of complexity to it. If you're familiar with other languages that use static typing, then you've got a leg up. But in the first place, I don't know, it's a good start. So, yeah.
So I'm familiar with like prop types. I don't know in React.
Yes.
I'm not familiar with types. I actually don't know prop types that well. Just know that kind of like it sounds like they do kind of similar things.
Yeah, they do very similar things. If you're using a language like TypeScript, or if you're using flow type annotations, which are pretty similar, then you don't need to use prop types. Because what you're doing essentially is for every one of your React classes, or even your pure functions, you're basically saying that this is going to take in this set of props, a string, a number, a function, or whatever else. And so that's actually one of the reasons that prop types has been extracted from the React from the React framework, because they're moving toward expecting people to use things like TypeScript or Flow, which do all that sort of like, this component expects these things to be passed in, or else it simply won't work sort of thing. It's better than prop types because the code doesn't even compile if you're passing the wrong stuff into certain instantiations of your components. So yeah, it's a replacement definitely for prop types. On that note, talking about React, another big difference from way back in the day is that now we have HTML first sites and JavaScript first sites. And this kind of existed back in the day. Like when I started teaching, there were things like Backbone, and there was Knockout, and there were other sorts of libraries that allowed you to use JavaScript to entirely build your site up. But now that's generally a whole category of its own. Apps or single-page apps or whatever you want to call them. Essentially, the idea is that the site that you're downloading contains almost no HTML. It contains like a script tag, maybe a title tag, maybe one or two other body element or something else, but not much else. What's the responsibility of that script that you downloaded is to generate your actual DOM, generate the actual site that you're on. So those I consider JavaScript-based websites. I used to call this like brochureware. I used to call this like web apps versus websites or whatever. But that said, I mean that doesn't mean that HTML-based websites don't have JavaScript on them, and that doesn't mean that JavaScript-based websites can't initially download HTML if that makes them faster. There's this concept of server-side rendering where where the server takes the first pass at rendering your single-page application, and then the JavaScript on the browser takes it from there. So, there's a whole bunch of different ways of seeing how it's done and everything. But generally, if you're looking at a marketing site or a blog or a news site or whatever else, generally that's what HTML first stuff is for, because you usually don't really need a whole bunch of massive, like really complex interaction to view the site. But anything that's really considered an app that has interaction, it has toggling, it has logging in, it has any sort of interaction, or a whole lot of interaction, more interaction than actually just reading. That's usually where JavaScript-based websites come about. And single-page apps are definitely more popular than ever. And thanks to single-page applications, learning full stack is really less important than it's ever been. You can be a front-end web developer without knowing what Rails is, without even having to write Node, without writing a single line of PHP, that's for sure. You don't need to do any of that generally, because single-page applications at the end of the day are essentially static sites, which means they're just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so your job could really just be to write static write single-page applications and not care about the server that you're talking to. Many backends have become API-only services because you've got a front end that simply makes requests to an API. So the back-end people, the ops people, everybody else, they're working on the Java, the C#, the Node, the whatever else side of things. It doesn't really matter for us front-end developers because we're all communicating it with one of two different ways: either RESTful, communication via HTTP calls, or GraphQL, which is another way of talking to the back-end. That's something that Facebook introduced. I don't really need to talk about it, but either way, there's more of a separation than ever. So that's a cool thing. Yes.
As opposed to like what was it before?
What it was before was that you would depend on the server to generate a lot of your content, to generate a lot of your HTML, to give you a list of users in HTML format that you would inject into the page or whatever else. Essentially, because, or you would depend on the server to give you your HTML, your JavaScript, your CSS files in the first place. But now that we have these single-page applications, they can be served from things like S3, static hosting, GitHub pages, other places that don't necessarily need to have any sort of JavaScript, Java, Perl, PHP, whatever else running behind it. And that leaves the API responsible only for responding to those sorts of requests. It means that they can be deployed separately to two entirely different things. They don't really need to intertwine or intermingle at all. Like nowadays, what I usually do is I talk with the API team and I say, hey, I need this API that responds with this data when I send it this request, but I never need to actually delve into their code. That's what I used to have to do as someone who focused on the front end. Still needed to do some full stack work to get my job done because I needed to surface certain things through whatever framework I was using, usually Rails. But I generally don't have to do that anymore. And that's thanks to the fact that these are self-contained single-page applications that aren't running on top of any server necessarily. So that's the difference. Yeah, cool. And another thing about single-page applications is that you don't have to worry about SEO. You used to have to worry about SEO. Let's talk about that. SEO stands for search engine optimization. It means making sure that your page looks good to web crawlers. That Googlebot can crawl this, index your page, and prioritize it because it has the information that people are looking for. In the infancy of single-page applications that generated HTML for you, crawlers like Google were not able to read any of that stuff because it wasn't inside the HTML. And because it wasn't in the HTML and it was in some JavaScript file somewhere, Google didn't take the time to actually run it and see what was inside it and generate a page using it. Things have changed now. Instead of crawling source, instead of crawling just the HTML, they crawl the DOM. That is, they crawl the actually generated version with JavaScript, with CSS of what the page looks like. So if you are writing a React or an Angular or a Vue or whatever else based website, you don't have to worry about it not being indexable or readable by at least Google, probably Bing at this point, I would hope. So that's a thing. No longer need to do that. No longer need to use alternative methods to create SEO-friendly versions. Yeah.
So that, if I remember correctly, that was like one of the big strengths of server-side rendering, right? It was like why you have to get SEO-friendly stuff. So what are the strengths now, like since that's not on the table anymore, to do server-side rendering?
The strength of server-side rendering, I'd say the single strength nowadays is that you don't need to wait for a massive bundle of JavaScript to load into the browser for your page to be visible. There's this concept of time to first view, where how long it takes your users to actually see your web page. And if they need to first download a 500 kilobyte massive JavaScript bundle that has to do all the work and start downloading, calling APIs and whatever to actually render your page from the start, you're going to have a lot of people dropping off, going like, this page is broken, I'm going to find my information somewhere else, right? So server-side rendering takes care of that because that means that the very first thing that you see, even before the JavaScript even starts running on the page, is what the server is giving you. And then the JavaScript can take over. So that's one strength of server-side rendering. Yeah.
Is there sort of a rule of thumb by like if your site's taking this long to load, like immediately you need to change the website to server-side rendering, or it's this size or something?
It's always a moving target. Based on what your target is in terms of like who you're trying, who you're trying to reach, what your audience is, whether you're reaching people who still have feature phones or really, really slow connections. And of course, things get faster all the time. Cell towers get faster all the time. Things get more ubiquitous. So, things change. But of course, there are different ways to make your bundle size smaller or simply to make your page perceptibly load faster. One of the biggest things that everybody should have at this point in terms of downloading files is you should have gzip enabled. That is to say, your server should be set up to compress the assets that are being downloaded onto people's browsers, because every browser nowadays, that's another thing that has changed, every browser nowadays can take a compressed file and extract it, and that saves you. Oftentimes, gzip files are like 1/10 the size of the originals. So that'll cut down a 500 kilobyte load to like 50 at times, which is a lot more palatable. So that's something that everybody should be doing. It's a no-brainer. It just helps out.
Is that just a library off for Node or something?
It's not a library. It's a feature of well, for Node I think it's a feature of Express, or it's an easy module that you can install. And then every server has a different way of enabling it. Usually it's on the Apache or the Nginx level. But yeah, there are very easy ways of making sure that your stuff's compressed as it reaches the client. Cool. And finally, HTTPS is becoming the default. Back in 2011, if you asked me, is HTTP dangerous? I'd go well, everybody uses HTTP, whatever. But it's funny because right when I started teaching, somebody released an extension for Firefox called Firesheep. I'm not sure if anyone remembers this, but essentially Firesheep, you could go to an open Wi-Fi network like Noisebridge, and you could connect. You could open up your computer, and Firesheep was a little sidebar in Firefox that would load up the Facebook or Twitter or sometimes Gmail sessions of every single person who was sitting around you, because everybody was connected completely unsecurely via HTTP to their service of choice. And that means you were able to slurp up what the cookies were, what the current session ID was, And that means you're essentially able to click and log in as them without any trouble whatsoever. So obviously that's bad, and that's why every reputable service out there that requires you to sign up or do anything uses HTTP. And in the future, every single website should use HTTP. Even if there's nothing security related or sign up related or whatever else about your service, you should be using HTTP because it protects because it protects your users, it protects their anonymity. There might be some secret stuff that you might not even know is being sent back and forth, some personally identifiable stuff. It's just safe for everybody. That's why eventually, maybe in a year or something, every single website that's loaded via HTTP will have a big warning message at the very top telling you that it's not secure. Well, it'll probably say not secure in black, but it'll probably turn red with a warning thing a little after that. Yeah, so they're doing a gradual, like this, I think right here it's basically saying like they're going to transition very slowly into warning you more and more. Probably within a few years you'll see a big red thing saying, go away, this page isn't secure, leave now, So, that's why certain things like HTTPS Everywhere is a really good extension for you to use. But it's also why it's now free and quite easy to to acquire HTTP certificates and implement them into your site. Let's Encrypt is one example of a free certificate authority where huh?
It's taking pretty long to try.
It's taking pretty long. What?
Yeah, they enforced all this. They enforced HTTP, so HTTPS, yeah.
It's just taking a long time for everyone to move the HTTPS route or something? Yeah, well, a lot of people don't know better. They think that certificates cost money. They think they're hard to implement. They still think that port 80 is the server along which all data should be served. So... Huh?
If it's a static website, there's no login.
No, that's not true. I mean, if you can be tracked. You can be sending some personally identifiable information without even knowing that you're doing it. Somebody could be man-in-the-middling you because, well, maybe not you, but as long as you are connected unsecurely to a website, somebody in the middle could be changing your information around. They could be changing what you receive. They could be misinforming you, or you could be misinforming the website in a bunch of different ways. So HTTPS protects from that. So even if you think what you're connecting to is entirely benign and has nothing to do with security or whatever, it's still a very good idea for everybody eventually to be using HTTPS. So that's one new sort of idea. Yeah, it's a trusted certificate authority. They don't offer every kind of certificate, but the ones they do, they work. They're secure. They have a nice little green lock in your address bar. Okay, so let's talk about what hasn't changed. First thing is that native apps are still more performant than non-native applications. That is to say, Apache Cordova, otherwise known as PhoneGap, there are other things like React Native. There are different ways of writing web languages, JavaScript and what have you, and having them run in an actual app that you download from your app store, from Google Play, from the Mac App Store or the iOS App Store or whatever else. But there's still downsides to the majority of them. They take more CPU, they take more memory. Some features that native applications make use of, the wrappers, the JavaScript wrappers, they can't do all the same stuff. So that I think is always going to be a downside. That's something that I thought at some time we were going to be like, write anything, it doesn't matter, everything's just totally fine, but that's not very much the case. Of course, the good news is that since 2011, at least Apple has introduced Swift, which at least makes writing stuff maybe a little easier or a little bit more familiar to more developers, because Swift at least looks more like things like Python, Ruby, JavaScript, what have you. But the good news is that there are a lot more options nowadays to write JavaScript once and then have it deployed to iOS, to Android, to whatever else. React Native being one of them. If you know about React and you want to use React to write native applications, React Native makes your stuff generally perform it. It actually creates real like iOS or real Android UI, real tab bars, real scrollable areas, real web views, real what have you. So you know, things are better, but native apps will probably always have the edge. Chrome is still king. It's been king since I started teaching, and it still is now. This green line here is Chrome. From 2009 to now, this is the user base. We're at about 56% Chrome usage around the world. Guess what this blue line is? That's Internet Explorer, yes. Internet Explorer is down. This gray line here is Safari. So Safari is number 2. And that includes mobile Safari. So like you might go like, who uses Safari on Mac? Most people use Safari on iOS, so that's why it's number 2. That said, a lot of people on Android also use Chrome, so this includes Chrome on Android. So you know, Chrome is still increasing its market share across all platforms. Semantic markup is still important. This is a personal little kind of passion of mine, which is writing HTML that doesn't look like div, 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 div. You can write HTML that uses much more descriptive tags like article, header, nav, aside. You can use headings where you're supposed to use headings. You can use paragraphs where you're supposed to use paragraph, lists, and all these other sorts of things. You can use all of the HTML elements because it's very helpful. Screen readers and Google crawlers and everything, they will understand better what your site is about if it's not just div, 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 div. If they know what the headings are on the page, if they know certain sort of data about what you're actually portraying, those tags do help. ARIA is an extension to HTML that allows you to add additional tags that explain certain interactions or certain sorts of things on the page that might not be exactly accessible just using HTML. Like ARIA, you can use ARIA attributes like ARIA dash expanded or ARIA dash, ARIA live.
For data that's updating interactively about the page every time you load.
Yeah.
This information is not available to assistive technology users.
Yeah. So if you're using JavaScript and you need to convey to people with screen readers that certain stuff has changed, ARIA tags changing on the page will make the screen readers, actually explain certain things. So adding certain, using certain elements, using certain tags, or using certain elements, attributes the right way will make it a better experience and also make your page more indexable and just better to approach. Especially now that we're using React. React has this problem where every component needs to have all of its elements wrapped in a single container. And that's going to change in React 16. But with React 15, at least for now, you need to create a lot of unnecessary divs to surround your content to get your stuff to work the right way. That's too bad, but a lot of the times you could use different elements instead of divs. Use sections, use whatever else. But either way, it's not the end of the world if your page is just like div, 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 but it works better in many cases. So that's something that was true back then and is still true now. Developers still need laptops. You are expected to own a laptop if you are a developer. I will say, there have been people who have come to my class just with tablets. And it sounds funny, but I respect them because they're trying to get work done and everything, and they have not worked with laptops in the past. They're new to technology. They're getting the most popular devices out there, and they're iPads or they're Android tablets or whatever else is. So the problem is, though, that you really can't get your work done just using tablets. You can try. This is Coda, which is one of a few different IDEs that's available for iOS and iPad. You can use terminals to SSH to virtual private servers to get your work done, get your compilation done, get whatever you need. But you really need Node in a lot of the cases. You need a local terminal. You need to be able to install things. You need to have root on your device to be able to get work done. So, that's why we're not necessarily going to see developers just walking around with tablets anywhere in the near future, at least. Traditional education still lags behind. Here is a class for the upcoming semester at UC Berkeley Extension, JavaScript and jQuery. I would not go to this class if I were you, because learning jQuery in 2017 is probably not the most important, not the best use of your time. But it's not only, it's the thing about colleges is that colleges are taught by professors. Professors have a full-time job, which is to teach. It's very difficult for certain professors who are teaching, software development in a bunch of different ways to keep up with a rapidly changing industry. So you can't really expect those people whose job it is to teach to necessarily always be up to date with the latest stuff when they've got a syllabus set in stone, when they've got only so many hours out of the day. But there's also problems with boot camps. Boot camps are still around. You can pay an exorbitant amount of money and then get an exorbitant income out of the boot camp. So that's great. But certain boot camps have failed. Iron Yard and I think not Dead Boot Camp. What's it called? General Assembly. I think those are gone. They simply could not remain profitable. And a lot of people a lot of boot camps are no longer guaranteeing you'll get a job after whatever else. They're changing their tactics. They're realizing that what they're teaching people isn't necessarily that great because they're extending their syllabuses to like a whole year because they realize that you really need experience. You really, really, really need experience on the job or at least hobbyist work to be able to get a good job. It's not just being told how to do things and working ridiculous hours out of the day, which I also take issue with, to get your stuff done. So yeah, there's problems with a lot of different kinds of education. That's something that hasn't changed. Yes, perfect. Use Google. Yes.
So when you go to a front-end interview and you're expected to do like a front-end challenge, would you like advise the people here to use vanilla.js and not jQuery, even though you only have like 30 minutes of time?
No. If jQuery makes you go faster, use jQuery. I interview people at Lab Zero, and oftentimes the things that I'm asking them to do could be completed with a few lines of jQuery or maybe a few dozen lines of vanilla.js. If they can do it the best way and that's what they're most comfortable with, I want to see them do things fast and do things efficiently. So, even though I say that jQuery is not necessarily the best thing to learn today, if you know it and if it makes you fast, then by all means, do what you know.
Well, I mean, what if you don't know jQuery very well, but is it good to learn for the sake of being fast?
Well, I would say no because most people are looking for single-page app devs nowadays. Most companies are looking for people who know Angular, know React, know Vue, know some other sort of more modern library. So, although it certainly doesn't hurt to learn jQuery, and although there are many companies that are looking for people who know it, it's still something that you'll see on a lot of job postings. I would say that it's less important than ever, and it's not necessarily something that you need to know. Yeah.
You mentioned React a lot.
Yes.
Is Angular sort of going away? Because they did Angular 2. That's
Angular is not going away. Angular.js, which is version 1, is still being used and still being supported kind of, but that's generally going away. Angular, which is version 2 and above, which we're now on version 4, is still being used, still just a fine library. It's more of a framework than say just React is, in that it does more stuff for you. So you'll find yourself, if you are writing an Angular application, that your applications look pretty similar to one another, which is beneficial. And so yeah, it is quite popular. Even if it's a name recognition thing, people are still using it. I wouldn't say it's going away or dying or anything like that. But it is definitely not as popular as React. And Vue is also starting to climb the ranks too. So, I mean, I personally don't know Angular 4, but, I don't think it would be really that difficult for me to spend time doing that and everything. Anyway, here's my last point, which is a depressing thing to end on, but this is the truth. Tech is still run by white men. I did a little research about whether things have changed over the past year. I thought I'd be able to put this into what has changed over the years, section, but I really can't because 25% of women are in STEM type things, specifically computational or mathematical stuff. 33% web developers are women. That's actually higher than I thought. That's pretty good. 17% of startups have a female founder. That's been the same way for a very long time now. There are a few companies that I know that are run by women, which is pretty cool, but really it's not a new trend. It's just kind of the same as it's always been. This statistic, 2% of Googlers are black, 3% are Hispanic, has not changed over a number of years. I took a look at these big four, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Google. They've got diversity pages, and they show how things have changed over the years. Things really haven't changed over the years.
I feel like those numbers have actually gone up. I don't know. It seems like if you look at like campus graduation rates, I feel like
so that might be the case. I mean, campus graduation rates might lead to different things, but better things in the next few years. But I'm comparing 2015 to 2013, and 2016, sorry, to 2013. They don't have 2017 data yet. 2016. No, I'm just talking. Well, maybe over 10 years, but they don't have that data. Yeah. What I'm saying is that things have pretty much remained stagnant over the last 3 or 4 years. Maybe slightly more women, but people of color pretty much the same across the board. Maybe 1% more, 1% less, but not that much. Things really haven't changed. Good news is that there's a lot of different ways that employers and other coworkers and everything can learn to help other people get into tech. Project Include is a really good resource. It's run by a bunch of people, including like Ellen Powell and other kind of like outspoken women, other people of color who are trying to get people into tech. And there are also boot camps. Even though I said my piece about boot camps, there are still ones that focus on marginalized communities and trying to get them into tech. If that's the good thing to do for people. So yeah, there are a lot of resources that I would recommend everybody take a look at, and try to, if you are currently employed or if you're looking for work or whatever else, keep in mind that employers should be doing better in trying to find more people. There should be more outreach. There should be more inclusivity at conventions and talks and what have you. A lot of them have done well, but there's always room for growth. But yeah, that said, that's it. Thanks for coming, and yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks. I'm going to stick around here for a little bit. I'm going to take a look around and see how everything's changed. I hope everybody's been able to see all the other cool stuff that's been happening here. Of course, this was in the past, but like there was a cool party last night where there were performers and whatever else, and we're going to have more performers later. Singers and speakers, and there's other classes happening right now. So I very much recommend checking all that out and seeing what else is happening around the area. In case you haven't seen the schedule for the whole 10th anniversary thing, here it is. We're here at 15 o'clock right now. There's going to be afternoon tea in an hour. There's going to be circuit hacking later. This is something I'd really like to see. I'm not sure if I'm going to be sticking around here for that long, but 5 minutes of fame is essentially lightning talks. People go up for 5 minutes and bring their ridiculous ideas or stories or inventions or whatever and show them to a crowd. Always a blast. Run by Danny O'Brien, who's a very long-time noise bridger. So there's really cool stuff happening for the rest of the day. But yeah, otherwise that's it for me. So thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? Final stuff they want to know about? Or yeah. Yeah, I will say that basically because I've been heads down on React projects at work for the past year or so, that I don't have firsthand experience with either Vue or Angular. But what I do know is that there are a lot of similarities, more similarities than differences. Vue and React specifically are quite similar because they're just UI libraries. They don't like try to do the soup and nuts and bolts routing and Ajaxing and everything else like Angular does. The biggest difference between Vue is that it uses templates, whereas React uses JSX. So you still got like this sort of HTML type stuff with binding like v-this, v-that, stuff that you used to see in AngularJS version 1. That's still there. In some ways, Vue is a lot faster. In some ways, it's not as much. There are certain libraries that work along with Vue, like Vuex, that allow you to do state management, much like Redux or MobX does with React. I don't know. I mean, really, at the end of the day, both of them have a virtual DOM. Both of them, have similar, sorts of approaches. Really, you don't need to choose. I personally choose React just because that's what I do at my job a whole lot. But like, because they're just UI libraries, you can still use a lot of the same sorts of surrounding tools. In fact, you could even use Redux with Vue if you wanted to. You could use, you could use reselect and normalizer and immutable and all these other sorts of tools that often get bundled in with React to make a full application. There are things that generate Vue projects. There are things that generate React projects, like Create React App. So again, I personally don't have firsthand experience. I really can't tell you what's better or what's worse. What I do know is that Vue is MIT licensed. Facebook is BSD3 licensed. It's owned by Facebook. Vue is just run by a smaller group of people. Vue is very popular for the small amount of people that actually work on it. It has a similar amount of stars on GitHub to React, and React is developed by thousands of people. It's because it's developed by a smaller team. They generally have maybe slightly better code standards or work at making their library a little bit smaller. So that's admirable. But whether that really affects your bottom line at the end of the day, whether to choose one or the other, I really can't say. All I can say is they both sound like perfectly respectable libraries. And Angular sounds cool too, if that's what you want to use. So that's all I know about Vue. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
What is the future of web development look like?
Future? Oh yeah, that's great. That's what is the future of web development? Well, that's a great question. It's something that I haven't really been able to over the years, predict. Things have certainly changed in different ways. But I mean, what I can say is I think that web development, front-end web development at least, is going to continue to be a much more kind of consolidated career versus like having to know the full stack or also doing API or ops or whatever else. Not that that's a bad thing, but generally there are going to be people who are specialists in this specific thing. It's going to get a lot more complicated in terms of people are going to be considered more actual programmers. I mean, when JavaScript entered the scene, people are like, well, it's a script. It's not a full programming language. It's not going to be able to do all the stuff that C++ or that Java itself or whatever else can do. That has changed. I would say that I consider myself more a software engineer than ever, and I think that's only going to get more. I mean, things are probably going to be more complex as they move on. Something I didn't really expect over the years is that the node ecosystem is comprised of many very small libraries that all work together to form a whole. I'm not really sure if things are going to continue to go that way and get even smaller, or if there's going to be a replacement for this ecosystem where you have like different tools that can do different things. If JavaScript itself is going to become more of a powerful language that you're going to find yourself not having to go out and find all these different libraries that do different sorts of edge case things, I really can't say. I would just assume that there's still going to be like the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium that makes sure that HTML, CSS, JavaScript are still to spec. I don't see any differences in I don't think CSS is going away. I don't think JavaScript will ever be replaced in the browser, for better or for worse. I think that people will still probably 10 years from now be using regular web apps and websites. I think that VR is going to collapse. That's my personal thought. That even though we have web VR and web AR and all these other cool things and experiences, on hot days like this, you definitely don't want to put an HTC Vive on your head. So, that's one of the reasons why I think, this is another thing actually that I didn't really think would happen even 10 years ago, that people would stop calling each other on the phone and just text each other. I didn't really think that people would stop wanting to watch videos with sound in them. I didn't really think that people would want less and not more, So I think things are going to be just focused, things on the web are going to be focused on people just getting their work done, getting things done, and getting things out of the way. But who knows? I don't know if Facebook's gonna still be popular for people. I mean, the younger generation doesn't really use this as much as people in their later 20s and 30s and everything, for one thing. I don't know what social networks are going to be like. I really can't say. But as for technology, I think that things are simply just going to, I don't know, keep changing marginally. But I will say generally that things are going to change probably at a slower pace than they have in the past. That things have gotten a lot more mature over the past few years. The way things are done. I mean, that's not to say that there won't be another 10 new UI frameworks that are coming out in the next year or whatever that people are going to be jumping on. But I do think that there's going to be less churn, less new things to have to learn every single year. That's just my thought, but I'm not really sure. That's actually going to be the case.
I think the major weakness of JavaScript, as it is now, is that it doesn't support multi-threading. Do you think that will change?
Yes, I do. There was just a post on the WebKit blog. Let me see if I can bring it up. About concurrent JavaScript and about shared array buffer. And there are people out there who are trying to, talk about heaps, concurrency, and the future of things happening in threads and whatever else. So that is something that might change in the future. So JavaScript itself being like a single-threaded language might not always be the case. So yes.
If you wanted to get into like animation, on like 2D animation, not like geo, what is a good way to get into that now?
That's a great question.
I've seen a lot of like libraries for like 1 or 2 text effects, or
Yes.
like a very simple, like super complex CSS animation.
Yes. I am trying to remember what it's called. I'm definitely not going to remember it off the top of my head. There was a Adobe Animator, formerly known as Macromedia Flash Pro, not replacement, but something done entirely in Canvas, essentially, to create very Flash-like animations. It allowed you to use JavaScript, which of course is like ActionScript, right? You can call events. You had a timeline. You had a whole bunch of really cool stuff that was available. I forget what it's called, but generally, I think that in the future, I mean, there's nothing as easy as, say, like Adobe Animator that just allows you to like create some stuff on a timeline, then make games and make interactions and stuff like that. I'm not really sure if anything like that will really come about. I hope so, but I think the reason that you're not seeing anything to like replace Adobe Animator is because a lot of that sort of animation stuff has gone to YouTube. A lot of the programming type stuff has simply gone to, well, things like WebGL or other sorts of Canvas-based things, or people are moved on to Steam, or like Unity, or making other sorts of things that aren't web-based. So I really hope that the web can support, rich multimedia, easy to make games and animations and things like that.
You would not use a plugin like Flash.
No.
I'm glad to see it die.
Yes. Well, I mean, the replacement is currently Canvas 2D context, whereas WebGL is Canvas with a 3D context. Canvas 2D, that's. But there's
no like set library.
There's not one library that makes it really easy to work with it necessarily. I mean, like the API is very much like Turtle or Logo or whatever it's called, where you're saying like move cursor left thing. Draw a line this way, change text, change color, change size. I mean, there are things that sit on top of it. There's two.js, two.js. That's one thing that's been around for a little while that allows you to work with it on a certain level. There's also d3.js, which is SVG chart-based things. There are a whole bunch of different things out there that make it easier to work with these technologies. But I don't know of a specific like smoking gun or smoke, whatever the term is, that makes it necessarily any easier to, like as easy with a full professional program like Flash or like whatever else to like use those technologies. But there are things out there. Let me just see, like Canvas-based Flash alternative. What's that thing called? Man.
Yeah, I think that works like an IDE would be wonderful.
I'm trying to remember what this thing is called. It was really cool, but yeah, I don't know. Canvas Writer, that's cute. It's like it was something really recent. I don't know, but it's still in its infancy too. So it's not something that can necessarily like take the place of it. And it is like browser based, so that has its place. Yeah. All I can say is, I'd say Canvas is the future for animation type stuff, but yeah, like it's certainly not as easy to make things as it is with Flash, and I hope that changes. Yeah. I don't see why not. The good thing about React is that it doesn't require the DOM to work. React DOM is one library that allows you to render your React, virtual DOM to to the actual browser DOM. But there's also React Native that allows you to render your virtual DOM in React to iOS or to Android. There's also, this is funny. This is React for the terminal. You can create something that looks like this that actually renders out things into your terminal. So React is just a certain way, a component-based way of creating components that can be rendered out in a whole bunch of different ways. So like, I would say that React for Canvas, it probably exists. Let me see. Oh yeah. Yep. Yeah, I mean it's definitely possible, but like an SVG can be embedded inside HTML, so you can certainly use React DOM for that. But I'm not really sure. I did make something. I did make a React game once. What's it called? I search myself. Here it is. I made a little thing that it's a physics-based little game where you try to keep the hexagon on top of these things here. And this is actually running a lot slower than I remember it. Maybe because it's connected to the display or whatever. But it's this is React-based. It's updating the styles of all these different sorts of elements on the page, and doing that with SVG, just changing the polygons and the paths and all these sorts of things. Like you do it. I don't see what the problem is.
I don't know, I can't really change it back into React components.
No, that's not true. I mean, you can really just type out like React DOM.render bracket SVG blah 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 blah, and like you can start like you can use like the actual G element or the path element or the whatever else elements like that are all in SVG, and just like render them out with different attributes the exact same way you do HTML. You don't need to import anything because it's definitely part of the built-in like React supported attributes. DOM elements. If you take a look, they have a list of all of the different SVG things. React supports these SVG attributes. So you can. So it's definitely like first-class SVG support. That's all I can say. Yeah. Yes. You literally just copy and paste your SVG directly into your JSX render call, and you can render out SVG. It doesn't need to be imported. You don't need to use an image tag. Don't need to use an embed or object tag. You literally just write SVG, and it's embedded directly into your HTML. Yeah. So that is something. Okay. I'm going to call it quits. So thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for coming. And I'll see you guys.